Professor Huang, Professor Chen, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is a great honor for the Research Center for Science and Technology for Learning to host this forum today. This event is mainly sponsored by the National Science Forum of Taiwan and organized by the Office of National Science and Technology for e-learning today. Today, our invited speaker, Professor J. Michael Spector, will share his research experience on e-learning on the following two topics today. The first one is trends and issues in e-learning research and development. And the second one is making educational research counts. Followed by each topic, a 20-minute question and ask is scheduled. From 10:30 to 10:40, a coffee break is arranged in the hallway. Please excuse me from reminding you that food and drinks are prohibited in the conference room. If you need any assistance during the forum, please feel free to approach our staff. Thank you in advance for your cooperation and attention today. So, now first of all, let's all invite our Program Office Director to deliver his welcome remark, Professor Xingtan Huang.
Professor Spector, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to welcome all of you to attend today's forum. We are very pleased to have invited Professor Spector to deliver two keynotes to share his experience in e-learning related research. Professor Spector is currently with Florida State University and is the Associate Director of Learning System Institute. He also serves as Executive Vice President on the International Board of Standards for Training, Performance, and Instruction, and the editor of the prestigious journal ETR&D. As the title shown, Professor Spector has been playing an important role in e-learning related international society. Most of you might already knew we are conducting the international project on e-learning. The project started 4 years ago. This year is the last year of the 5-year project. During the past 4 years, we have made significant achievement either in academic research or in industry development. We hope this forum will stroke up a dialogue among the scholars here and Professor Spector. With all your full participation, it's for sure the forum will be very enjoyable and fruitful. Thank you again for coming, especially thank you, Spector, for flying all the way from the United States to attend this forum. Thank you all.
That should turn it on, I think. Yeah, this will be easier if I control it from here. So thank you for that kind introduction, and it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me, and I hope I can share with you some interesting ideas and experiences in the two presentations that I'm going to make. So as to be informal, I'm going to sit down, and I invite questions whenever they occur. If something's not clear, after the 15th or 16th time, if it's not clear, then just give me an indication and I'll try and respond as we go along. And I know there's time at the end for questions and answers too. But I think these slides are available. Some of you may already have them, but if not, you can send me an email here or ask Professor Chen, and somebody will make the slides available. There are some references that you might want to see along the way. What is this asking me? You didn't know I could read Chinese. I just learned yesterday. So that should be a familiar sight. So I thought I should have something that's familiar and something that's not so familiar. This picture is from Florida State University, and it's a football stadium. So, and it seats 80,000 people. So, and my office is located about right here. So on weekends, I have 80,000 visitors. I don't get to work on weekends. It's a built-in benefit, no work on weekends because of football games. So it's nice. But this is also the offices on this third floor here where the Learning Systems Institute is located. It's the main offices. We have 3 different locations at Florida State University. It's a large campus with 40,000 students. The Learning Systems Institute is an independent research part of the university with about 400 people working, faculty, graduate research assistants, and support staff. And I've been there about 2.5 years. Before I went to Florida State, I was at Syracuse University, where I headed the program on instructional design development and evaluation. And before that, I was in Norway. I'm used to cold weather. Today is not cold and rainy. This is typical weather for Bergen, Norway. So I'm very used to it. These are the topics that I will cover as we go along today. So there's going to be some broad topics, and then a look at, maybe a quick look at an in-depth issue that I think is important and unresolved, not just with regard to e-learning, but with regard to technology-enhanced learning. So this will be at multiple levels. I'm not quite familiar with the audience. I didn't know what to expect. Yesterday I had a nice introduction to the e-learning program that the National Science and Technology program is sponsoring. And I also visited III, and was very impressed with things you've been doing. But still, I didn't know ahead of time who I would be addressing, so I put things at multiple levels. So along the way, hopefully there will be something I say that makes sense or that provokes a question. So the first thing I thought we would talk about was this little e in the word e-learning, and give you some of my perspective on what this little word means. I think it's actually overused, so I'm going to make fun of the term e-learning. So students, my students, that I've taught in online environments for more than 8 or 9 years when I started doing this in Norway, and then I continued in Syracuse. I started an online master's program in Syracuse University, and we're doing the same thing at Florida State. My experience with students is they think of the E as this course will be easy because it's online. So I won't have to go to class, I won't have to put up with that mean old professor, and I won't have to do as much reading. It turns out that's typically not what happens, but that's their common expectations, at least in the United States and also in Europe. That's a common expectation. I don't know if that happens here, but it's something to be dealt with as you plan courses. The community, the research community and the development community think of the E in terms of ubiquitous. So anyone, anywhere. So the E could be, we can deliver learning to everyone, everywhere in the world. And that's also not true, because not everyone, not even everyone in Taiwan has access. So there are people that can't be reached in spite of the widespread availability of digital technologies. I guess historically, the E comes from electronics. So that may be the most true version of E and e-learning. So if you take that, then you come away with e-learning as technology-supported learning. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the internet. So it could be any use of technology to support learning and instruction. And that's actually how I think about e-learning. So that's not the common use when you read articles about e-learning, because people are thinking of telecommunications. But I think of a wide variety of electronic means. So that's the first pass at a word. I don't know if that reaches a resonant note, but there's a lot of misunderstanding when people talk about e-learning. It can mean almost anything to anybody. But I'm arguing for a broad interpretation. So again, this is making fun of the word estrangement. In English, that means you feel alienated, apart from, away from something. So e-learning has this effect that learners, especially students, may be estranged from the professors or the sources of knowledge with which they're interacting. And so that's something that needs to be taken into account. It's an important issue for e-learning. So how do we deal with the estrangement, that idea of E, the fact that the students feel separated from the instructors? That does need to be planned for when you're designing instruction. So, and the idea here is in distance learning, the learners and the teachers are not often at the same location, and they may not be working at the same time. And if they are working at the same time, the common term for that, I know this is familiar for all of you, is synchronous. And if it's other than the same time, then it would be asynchronous. And then there's this notion of blended learning or hybrid learning or integrated learning. And I want to distinguish those three terms. Blended typically means it's a combination of electronically supported technology for learning and some other kind of typically classroom instruction. So you put together multiple forms of instruction and you put those together and you have a blended environment. Hybrid means you're mixing these within a course in a slightly more integrated fashion. So you might have a computer-based simulation, then you might have a lecture, and then you might have an online discussion. So the distinction between hybrid and blended is not often clear, and those are used pretty much synonymously. The third term that's associated with blended or hybrid learning is integrated learning environment. And the way I interpret integrated is it's through a common interface. So you may have multiple forms. You may have synchronous and asynchronous and classroom instruction and simulations, but the way the learner reaches all of those forms is through a common interface. And they are blended together so that one form of instruction supports the next form of instruction. That's the most difficult thing to achieve from a planning point of view. So if we have integrated learning, requires a lot more planning, a lot more resources, but possibly it can be more effective. So based on what I've said so far, then the conclusion is there are a lot of different kinds of e-learning. So they might be forms that occur when the instructor and the students are working at the same time, synchronous, asynchronous, different times. It might be a mix of online, hybrid, integrated environments. There might be individualized and personalized instruction, which you can achieve using computer systems, intelligent tutoring systems, and some web-based systems allow some level of individualization or personalization. What web-based systems are good at is supporting collaborative learning. So people get together in a discussion room or a blog or a wiki, and they work together towards some common goal. Some learning environments can be highly structured, the way a lecture is. I had a topical outline, so this is highly structured. But I typically don't work in a highly structured environment, so I'm easily distracted. Some learning environments can be very open-ended, so they're driven by individual learner interest, and learners can go off in many directions, and they often do. We do know some things about which of these approaches are likely to be effective with different kinds of learners. So that, do you hear this echo, or is it just me? Is there something I can do about it? It'll drive me crazy, or it'll drive you crazy. Or maybe if I just locate it further away, maybe that's it. Distance and distance education. I wanted to say something about, we know some things from learning research about which of these modalities are likely to be more or less effective with different kinds of learners. When a learner comes to a new topic area and they're not very experienced with not much background, it's very often the case that a lot of support, a lot of structure is going to be helpful. As learners gain competence and they gain confidence, then that structure and support can be taken away, faded away, and the learner can be provided with a more open-ended environment. That's also likely to be effective. And it's likely to be more motivating to a new learner to have very explicit goals, and for an advanced learner to have very explicit challenges, so with a more open-ended approach. So we can build learning environments, e-learning environments, and other kinds based on some of these lessons learned from the past. And I'm going to review a few of these. So I'm in an instructional systems, instructional design background. That's where I've been working the last few years. So these are advice from a planning point of view, how we plan e-learning environments. And the temptation, of course, a new technology comes along. The temptation is to focus on the technology. And admittedly, I'm a geek. I like technologies, and I like to see what you can do with new technologies. But just because we can do it doesn't mean we ought to do it. So the focus should always be on learning. So my definition of learning is a pretty traditional one. Learning occurs when there is an observable change in attitudes, abilities, belief, knowledge, behavior that persists over time. So a change that persists is the indication that learning has occurred. So that means we have to focus on the idea that learning is all about change. You don't know that change occurs if you haven't taken some measures in advance and some measures after the fact. So that's the notion of pre and post assessment in order to establish that there has been learning on account of an e-learning environment or any other kind of environment. We have to measure change. So that's fundamental. It turns out, that seems obvious. I know everybody's shaking their head. Yes, yes, of course, Mike. But when you look at the research, there's not that much research that reports this kind of sustained, especially persistent change in behavior. So it's not only before, after, and then because it's a change that persists over time, it would be 3 months or 3 years later, there's been a persistent change in what people know or are able to do. Very little research supports that. The nice thing about your program, you have a 5-year program, probably another 5-year program. You have the opportunity to make these kinds of assessments and evaluations. So I hope you are doing it, and I encourage you to do more of that because it's much too rare in the literature. In the second talk, I'll talk about some publication issues. Then things that we've learned from the past. Just because new technologies come along or a new way to think about learning or how to support learning comes along, that doesn't mean we have to throw away everything we've learned from the past. And there's some big lessons learned from the past. And one of those is to account for variations in terms of learning outcomes, these persistent changes. It turns out that time spent on the task is the biggest indicator of, or predictor of what will be learned. So the more time students spend practicing something, the more likely they are to achieve a higher level of performance. Time on task is important. So you have to require practice. I know this is common in Taiwan. It's part of your culture. So you give a lot of homework and students do a lot of this. In the United States, unfortunately, this is not our culture. And so we're not producing such good results. And it shows up in the PISA studies, these international comparisons of student performance at different grade levels. The United States is not doing so well, and it's because of these two things. We don't require students to spend a lot of time on tasks, so they don't master complicated things. And teachers don't often provide timely and informative feedback. So what counts as timely and informative depends on individual learners. But so a new learner, timely and informative feedback will be right after they've done something or while they're doing something. And it's not, so it's timely right then, just when they need to know that they got it right or they got it wrong and why they got it right and why they got it wrong. For a new learner, that would be timely and informative. For an advanced learner, you really want to provide more time for reflection, especially on the why part. So you allow some time for the learner to figure out why things went right or why they went wrong. And that promotes this idea of self-regulated or metacognitive learning. The problem with feedback, though, is that, especially in American schools, teachers have too many students to deal with. So they can't give that kind of timely, informative feedback. Computer systems can do that. So that's one advantage of e-learning. It's the ability to provide that timely and informative feedback. So that needs to be designed in to an e-learning environment to take advantage of this very important lesson learned. You're nodding, yes, okay. Okay, what we hear, a lot of what I'm going to say, many of you have traveled to the United States. You've seen the American education system. It's ugly. How many of you have been there and visited universities or schools in the United States? Maybe a third or so. And you've read things, and they're all true, as I'm embarrassed to admit. One of the things we say in America is that technology will save us, and that web-based instruction is going to transform the classroom. It's really not happening in the United States. It could happen, but it's not happening. So things are happening pretty much as usual, in spite of the ability to use technology much differently than we have been. And I have some examples here. I don't know if we have the internet. What does that say? Well, maybe not. I can talk about them. I'm prepared to talk about them anyway. Maybe it's loading. It's not important. I'm prepared to just move forward in case it doesn't pop up. One is a document sharing system. This is a very powerful system developed by Xerox Corporation. Xerox has historically made the mistake of thinking they're a hardware corporation that develops copying machines and so forth. It turns out, oh, you mean we need to be connected to the internet to have access? What a strange thing. It's okay. I'll just keep talking. Thanks, though, for pointing out the obvious. That's good. It may be less distracting if I talk about this anyway. So thanks for that. Xerox historically has developed very innovative software. At Xerox PARC, and of course you know they're responsible for the GUI, the graphical user interface, not Apple, but Xerox PARC developed that idea. But they see themselves as a hardware company, so they keep giving away their software or not realizing how advanced it really is. And they've done it again with a document sharing system they developed for internal use of sharing documents. But it's really one of the easiest and most powerful ways to exchange information across the internet that I've come across. And it's called DocuShare. And we used it at Syracuse University, and we built courses around it. So you could build document repositories, portals, web portals. Before people were talking about web portals, you could create web portals using a system like DocuShare. There are other systems that support this. The nice thing about DocuShare is that there's no learning curve. Once you see it, in 2 minutes, you can be using it very effectively. So it's not intimidating for teachers. So one of the challenges is to get technology to be used by people who are not familiar with new technologies. So when you talk about knowledge management systems or web portals and so forth to teachers, they begin to lean back and their eyes close and they wonder, am I really going to be able to do this? But then you sit them in front of DocuShare and they're doing it within 2 minutes. So they overcome that initial fear of the technology quite easily. And so the technology gets used and it gets put into the classroom. Unfortunately, it's not affordable for schools and universities because it's an enterprise piece of software. Syracuse was a partner with Xerox, so we had a free copy of it, which I still use. I'm the administrator of that system at Syracuse still. But what it illustrates is simple solutions work well, especially with someone new to the technology. So if you want to introduce knowledge management systems into school-based learning and instruction, a system like DocuShare will work much better than any of the other systems. I don't know if you've seen SharePoint and some of the other ones that are like that. The interface, there's a learning curve. So you don't learn it in 2 minutes, maybe 2 weeks for a teacher that's not familiar with what to expect. And that's too much time for the teacher who has lots of other things to do, at least an American teacher with 30 kids, and they're all running in different directions. Children in Taiwan are much better behaved. I learned last night from Professor Chen's. Yeah. You don't have the same kinds of problems. The other common technology, I talk about DocuShare because you can use a knowledge management system, a web-based knowledge management system like DocuShare, to integrate into classroom-based instruction. And it's a very nice first step. And it's taking the first step and seeing that it's effective that can make a difference. The more dramatic first step is to take a lecture-based, classroom-based course and put it into a web-based environment. And there are lots of systems around to support this. I think I heard that Blackboard is used here at Central. But the other one's available. Moodle is an open source free piece of software. Some of you may have seen it. Sakai is another open source piece of software, much more powerful than Moodle, developed by a consortium of universities. WebCT has been absorbed by Blackboard. There's some advantages and disadvantages to using a course management system or a learning management system, such as one of these. If the expectation is you're going to replace, the typical expectation is we'll put the entire course into Blackboard and eliminate the classroom-based course. And I don't know if that happens here, but that's a common strategy in America. And it's not probably the best strategy. There's some reasons for doing that. One is financial or driven by money. You can reach students that you would otherwise not reach. So people not located in the city where the university is can enroll, pay money to the university, and take the course. So from the university's point of view, it generates revenue because you can reach more students. I maintain that's the wrong way to think about this. A better way to think about using a learning management system is this integrated or blended view. So you add it in a little bit at a time to a lecture-based course. So you have lectures and then you have discussions in one of these systems. And then gradually you put documents and you share documents there. And then you allow learners to have more control of the system so they can create their own repositories. Sakai gives you lots and lots of control for learners can have their own workspace, for example, and create their own wikis and discussion groups. And you don't do that all at once, especially if the learners aren't used to that kind of control or that kind of environment. A gradual introduction. It could happen over the course of one semester. So you start out, first of all, with the syllabus that's there, and they read that. And then you have a discussion group next that starts to work in addition to the lecture. And by the time you're at the end of the course, you have electronic portfolios being built and blogs and wikis going on. So that's a better way to make use of a learning management system. You can transform the classroom, but the thing that typically goes wrong, at least in what I've seen in the United States, is to expect the transformation to occur all at once. So we take this lecture-based course, we put it in Blackboard, and dramatically we're going to have wonderful results. And it typically doesn't happen that way, unfortunately. So I call this, I discovered this principle when I was doing research at the University of Bergen in Norway, the universal underlying principle of all systems. And the pronunciation is very difficult. Oops. Sorry. Oops. As you're familiar with this. From the planner's point of view, this principle always applies. I've never encountered an instance when this principle didn't apply. Something's already gone wrong. Somebody's decided the form of instruction, the modality, they've decided it will be completely in Blackboard and it'll be open to anybody anywhere in the world. Well, that's a decision somebody else made before I come to this as a designer. So how do I design a course with that kind of constraint? I mean, that's a serious constraint. I don't know how many people will be in the course. I don't know where they'll be. I don't know what languages they speak. This happened to me at Syracuse. I ended up with 100 people from all over, mostly the United States, in a new course. Somebody else made that decision for me, and it's hard to have 100 people in an online course and who have to develop projects and work in groups and drive the instructor crazy. So, but you can think of any project you've worked on, and probably you came to the project after somebody else made a decision that you didn't think was the best decision. So there's some consequences of doing this for web-based instructions. Well, first of all, the technology probably is going to break down at some point in time. Just before I left to come here, the mail server at the Learning Systems Institute was unavailable for 2 days. And the reason was they clean the carpets at the university. I think once a month they come in and clean all of the carpets, and the person cleaning the carpets went into the server room and basically bumped the mail server, knocked it offline. This happened late Friday night. And so the technology people weren't available until after I got here. So when I get here, I open my inbox, and there's 250 messages that have piled up. So that's unfortunate. So when that happens to students, when the server is not available to a student, they become very frustrated. And that frustration can build over time. And it will happen. But there are some advantages. I mentioned one already, is pick easy-to-use technologies first and introduce technologies gradually. So here's a little bit more on my OOPS principle. There's some corollaries to OOPS. And so you come to a project, a mistake has already occurred. That mistake inevitably will lead to other mistakes. So somebody has made a decision that this will be a web-based course in Blackboard. At Florida State, the way that Blackboard is set up, if a student's not registered in the system, you have to make individual requests to the Blackboard administrator to add that person into the system. If you have lots of these individuals, this takes a lot of time. So there can be that kind of mistake. So a new course for freshmen in Blackboard could be a mistake if somebody made that decision. Mistakes rarely happen in isolation, so you got to be careful to avoid these if possible, because one mistake will lead to another mistake. I've never had enough, well, that's not true. I hardly ever have had enough resources to do everything I wanted to do. I mentioned that I was in Norway for almost 4 years, and that was a strange experience. Some of you know Norway. It's a very rich country with oil and gas, and I was the head of a research unit there called Educational Information Science and Technology. And we had to turn in, I was the director, so we had to turn in budget requests every year. And I would base this year's request on what happened last year. And I would turn in a request, and every year they gave me about 50% more than what I asked for. So apart from that experience in Norway, I mean, Norwegians are crazy. I've never had enough resources to do what I thought should be done. If you're an instructor, if you have that experience, that you have more resources than you think you need, that's rare, so treasure it. But probably you won't have to have enough to do what needs to be done, so you have to make compromises. So then that means you have to set priorities for what you should do when, and it turns out other people, in my case this is always true, other people always have better ideas. Since you have to make compromises, it makes sense to talk to these other people, get their ideas, integrate their ideas into the solution. That was my stomach growling. Okay. Is that okay? You can still hear me in the back all right? So I could talk loud without a microphone probably. So this is my OOPS principle. It really goes to planning issues, and the bigger the project, or the larger the course or the program, the more important these principles become. And my assessment of what I've seen with regard to your e-learning program is you've done all of these things pretty well. This goes back to something I mentioned before about the pre and post measures, and learning is all about change. You have to take measures before and after. I call this the WYSIWYG principle. What you measure is what you get. This, of course, is a play on the WYSIWYG notion of editors. What you see is what you get on the screen. You print it, you get the same thing you see. So what you measure is what you get. So this has multiple meanings. And the first meaning is that students have lots of things to do. They are intermittently rational, which means they will sometimes try and optimize their time. So if they have multiple tasks, they're trying to achieve at an acceptable level on each of these tasks, they'll do only what's needed to get the level desired, but no more, because they have other things to do. So that's the notion of students will perform to the measure you set. So it's important to set a high measure, and students need to know what this measure is. Otherwise, they're likely to flounder about. We're going to try this again. Now it's on. People should come with batteries too. I think it's called coffee. Changing the batteries. So it's important to set high standards, and it's important for students to know what the standards are and to know how well they're performing against those standards. This is a very old idea, but it's being abandoned in the United States, which disturbs me. So I hope you don't go down the same path that we've been going down in the United States. You're nodding, you know about this. Here's some comments about trends. This talk was titled Trends. And I've taken some comments from 2 books about trends in e-learning. The first one is by Visser and colleagues, Trends and Issues in Distance Education, and it's a recently published book. Jan Visser has anybody come across Jan Visser? His PhD is from Florida State years and years ago. And his wife, Leah Visser, is a co-author, and his 2 daughters contributed to this book. He was born in Belgium. He lives in France and sometimes lives in Florida. He's a really interesting character. He's a physicist by background, but he's interested in the design and instruction in new learning systems. So he does some very interesting work. And so his idea is there's a tension in e-learning trends. There's a conservative tradition, which is going towards standardized competencies. There's a large European project right now called 10 Competence, which is trying to build standards for different disciplines for all of the members of the European community, and then implement these standards in education. There's a project by IEEE, the Learning Technology Technical Committee of IEEE is developing standards for educational technology curriculum at the undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate level. I happen to be a member of that committee. So that's what Visser would call a conservative trend. So e-learning is pushed because we can deliver to lots of people in lots of different places. We need to have common standards so we know that people who receive this instruction can perform to these standards. It's important for the European community, especially because they have this right to work law. So if you're a dentist in Greece and you move to Italy, you still have the right to practice dentistry, but not on my teeth. No. So this is recognized all over Europe, so that the competence in one country is transferable to another country. It's a nice idea. He calls that a conservative trend. The progressive trend, which he tends to favor this one, but he presents both reasonably neutrally, and I think both of these trends apply, is towards a more open-ended kind of self-organizing groups. So the e-technologies, internet technologies, really allow groups to come together around almost any topic. There's a serious game users group on the internet. Does anybody explore it? It's a vast set of resources and people interested in gaming. And there's other things similar to that. So these groups organize themselves. They have competitions. They have publications. They do all kinds of interesting things. So that's a very progressive trend, sort of anarchic, if you like, not so structured, not so constrained. And both of these things are happening on account of the internet at the same time. There's a clear trend toward more mobile technologies. This is a nice little computer, and of course they're getting smaller and smaller. And my little handheld PDA is actually a web phone, so I can get email, I can download attachments, read attachments, browse the internet, and be connected almost anywhere, except for Japan and Korea. Don't use the same standard as the rest of the world. Well, the United States doesn't either, but you can get a GSM phone in But there are more mobile technologies, and they're being introduced into classrooms. I don't know about Taiwanese classrooms, but I know the Koreans are using handheld devices in elementary education settings. And they're controlled with a sort of a local network that can push things and pull things from the handheld devices that students have. And they seem to be having quite a bit of success with these. Kids like them. I mean, they have some value immediately for kids because they play games on these things. So they get involved because they think, oh, it'll be a game. And then, uh-oh, I'm learning mathematics. Well, maybe it's like a game. I'll keep doing it for a while. But there is they've shown that there is some positive learning outcome doing that, if it's controlled appropriately. There is, in Visser's view, an increasing disparity in access and use. And this goes to the notion of the digital divide. I heard a little bit of this concern yesterday, and so Taiwan and the e-learning project is making a very overt attempt to address the digital divide and make sure this doesn't happen in this country. It doesn't seem like it is. My notion of the digital divide is we can solve that problem. I think you're solving it, or have already solved it in a fair and equitable way. The digital divide is not the concern. It's the knowledge divide that's the concern, the knowledge and performance divide. So are people learning and being able to perform skills at the same level anywhere and everywhere? That's the divide that I think we have to worry about. The digital divide will solve. And I think we're paving the way there. I don't know if you agree with that or not. But that's my view on that. I have a colleague, I don't know, you may have heard of Pierre Dillenburg. We both were, yeah. He's an interesting guy. He's a Belgian who's working in Geneva, Switzerland. And his notion is that e-learning should go away. The term contributes nothing. And it should always be about learning, not e-learning. So that was the opening part of my talk. He agrees with that. And he also agrees that it's the knowledge and performance divide is the issue, not the digital divide. But that's easy to say in a country like Switzerland or like Taiwan, where there's widespread access for nearly everybody and it's affordable for nearly everybody. There are other parts of the world where that's not true. So I guess they'll still be talking about the digital divide. Visser works a lot in Africa. So that's why this is an issue in his book. This idea of evolving paradigms and frameworks within the learning research community, you may have heard discussion that there is new learning paradigms are arising. They talk about this. Some of you may have read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. And he talks about paradigm shifts in science. And the example that's discussed in that book is the shift from Newtonian mechanics to relativity theory with Einstein. So that really was a dramatic shift. My view is nothing like that has ever occurred with regard to learning theory. And the reason is Newtonian mechanics was around for 300-400 years before this shift began to occur. It was an extremely well-established, well-documented, evidence-supported paradigm, scientific point of view. We don't have that, and learning theory is too new to have a paradigm. We're still struggling in that early stage to become a science. So this is not a popular view, by the way. And I'm in a minority on this, and probably some of you will disagree with this. So, but the typical talk among learning researchers is there was an early learning paradigm called behaviorism that shifted to a cognitive approach to learning, and now that's been sort of pushed aside in favor of a social constructivist view of learning. And my view is these are all too early. None of these count as paradigms. We're still forming a paradigm about learning. We have very incomplete knowledge, very partial knowledge of how learning occurs. In the computer science world, in another life, I was a computer scientist. There was a system, a Unix system called YAC, yet another compiler. Some of you were familiar with this, and you would get it when you got Unix. And a compiler is a computer program that will take its input would be source level code and produces output some machine interpretable code. So, and there are programs that do that. They're called compilers, and then there are programs to build compilers, and that would be a compiler. So YAC was one of these that you got from Unix. My view is there's something like this going on in learning theory. So the yak view was we're making fun of reinventing these compilers all the time. We know how to do this. Let's do it once and be done with it. And we have yet another pedagogical paradigm. It's as if learning theorists think they need to have a new term, a new perspective to get published. And so they invent something that sounds new and sexy and whatever. And, but it's really not new. So the lessons I talked about before, which were established in the so-called behaviorist paradigm, I don't think it was a paradigm, in the behaviorist period, time on task and timely and informative feedback, they're still as true today as they were 50 years ago. And people more or less learn today the way they learned 2,000 years ago. There's no evidence of significant change in how the human mind works. There is change in how we talk about things. So all of the stuff that goes around learning does change. The other book I wanted to mention, both of these are good resources, is a book by Ali Carr and her colleagues, a little bit different take on e-learning, which she takes a kind of skeptical view. She looks at what people are saying about e-learning and what actually happens around the world. And the book is arranged by regions of the world, and it's worth a look. So she sees open access as a democratizing force. The differences between Taiwan and China sort of make this clear. Just how open is your society going to be when you allow open access to all of the resources available on the internet? Taiwan is very open compared with China, at least that's my understanding of things. Taiwan is more open than the United States. We censor what kids see in school. So in order, is this news to you? In order for schools in the United States to get federal funding, they have to show that they have filter programs running on all of the computers that kids can touch. And it turns out, when you look at the things that get filtered, there's quite a few rich, worthy educational resources that are filtered out. So that's not a completely open society. So open access really should be open access. Leave it up to the teacher to decide and the learner to decide what contributes to learning. But, this is a myth. The open access is a democratizing force. It's not happening as much as it could. The change in funding and policies, that goes up and down. It goes up and down in the United States. It probably goes up and down in Taiwan, depending on how well the government's doing and so in the economy. And you'll get support or not support for things that you think are important. Typically, education is downgraded in terms of other things in society. So we invest in new infrastructure, utilities, transportation, other things before we, in the United States, of course, the military, before we invest in education. That's unfortunate. And there's some cases that show that if you invest significantly over a sustained period of time in education, the entire society benefits. And Ireland is a case in Europe where, it's been maybe 15 years now since they started their first 5-year program to, at a national level, invest in education at every level, elementary, secondary, college, postgraduate level. And it had a dramatic impact on the Irish economy. It's now one of the leading economies in Europe. So there was a delay. It took time for that to happen. But over a period of about 10 years, Ireland moved from one of the weakest economies and poorest performing economies in Europe to one of the highest performing economies in Europe. Similar kinds of things have happened in Finland and South Korea. So there's been sustained period unit of analysis. Learners are intermittently rational, which means sometimes they operate in a rational manner, which means that you can set goals, you can identify alternate means to achieve the goals, assess how well you're making progress towards the goal. That's my definition of rationality. Learners, like the rest of us, are intermittently rational. A lot of times we're not rational. And so what works in some situations will not necessarily generalize to other situations. Some research issues that I think are important. I want to get to a little bit of research I'm doing. I've done the broad bit. I want to go to depth with one particular area of research. It's this last item. how we assess learning progress in complex and ill-structured problem-solving domains. We really know how to support learning with regard to well-structured tasks. If it's a simple procedure and there's one right solution, we know how to teach people to do that. If it's declarative knowledge and there are right and wrong ways to classify items or put items into categories, we know how to teach those kinds of things. And we can use technology to support it. What we don't know so well is how to support learning in areas where, I'm going to skip with the task, are not so well defined. Maybe I should have skipped some of this. I've got a couple of intervening slides here. Teachers shouldn't be left behind, is what this slide says. I did a study in e-learning and found out that from the teacher's point of view, it takes a lot more time to run an online course than it does to run a lecture-based course. This is not news, and a lot of other studies have found very similar things. The problem from the system's point of view is that teachers aren't recognized for having invested significantly more time. And it's about twice as much time. And this is for teachers that have taught that online course many times before. It still takes more time to do it online than face-to-face for almost every kind of online environment, except for the personalized individual tutoring systems. So we don't support that well. This is the stuff on learning complex domains. So the way this works is, learning, if you think of learning as being driven by problems, there are problems that are complex, which means they have lots of different components and factors that influence outcomes. These factors and components are interrelated. They may change over time. The relationships among the components may be nonlinear, so it's difficult to predict in some cases what will happen because of factors interacting. And on account of that, there may be missing information, incomplete information that makes the problems ill-structured. This is an important class of problems that show up in almost every domain. In engineering design and medical diagnosis and environmental planning, in any area you can think of. You can think of a task that's got lots of interrelated factors and missing information. Complex and ill-structured problems. And we have curriculum intended to help people perform those tasks. So the research question is, how do we know the curriculum, the intervention, is actually improving problem-solving ability? The challenge is there are no right and wrong answers to this set of problems. So what kind of methodology will we develop as learning researchers to address this? Now, I have been using interactive simulations to support this kind of problem-solving task. And because I believed it was effective. And I told you I was a geek. I loved simulations. I had a methodology for designing simulations based on system dynamics. And I fell in love with the technology. But I didn't do the measures before, during, and after instruction. Were people actually learning anything? Were they getting better at solving ill-structured problems? Until Dave Merrill made a visit to me in Bergen and said, "Mike, that's really an interesting simulation. How do you know it works?" And I didn't have an answer. So I've been struggling with this, how to develop an answer. So people think about the problems differently. If you give someone an ill-structured problem and ask them to talk aloud about about the problem, you will get different representations. If you ask an expert to do the same thing, you will get a different representation. If you let people interact, that will alter the representations. And then one question is there a way to formalize these representations? And I think there is. I'm going to skip through these fairly quickly and say that this has to do with using concept maps and models to assess learning. They can also be used to support learning. This particular part of the talk is focused on assessing performance in complex learning tasks. Models always simplify things. So we'll skip through that. The way the human, oh, thank you, this is what I needed. I can go 10 more minutes. That's great. I can make things up for another 10 minutes. So the way this works is, according to a cognitive psychologist, we develop these internal representations of things around us. especially when we don't understand the things around us. Those are called mental models. We develop those representations because we need to take an action or make a decision. That's called a mental model. After a while, if we repeatedly use these same mental models, they become automated responses, an automatic response to that situation. Then it's a schema. So then it's thoughtless behavior. I'm using some mental structure, according to cognitive psychologists, but I don't have to think about it. I don't have to explain my action. I know how to behave. When I come to that red light, I stop. So that's a schema. The things in this bottom circle are things we never see. We never see mental models. We never see schema. We never see this process of making sense of our external experiences. What we do see are events in the world. These are the things we can measure. So this is what we have to pay attention to when we make inferences about the stuff down here. So we can see events in the external world. We can see representations of our mental models. So this is key. This is what I want to use for my assessment procedure, because I think there's a strong link here. And then we can assess whether action was effective or decision was effective or not. So I'm going to use a particular kind of concept map called a causal influence diagram, or a causal loop diagram. This is a technology used in system dynamics for eliciting knowledge from experts in a domain when they build a formal mathematical stock and flow model, a formal mathematical model of how a complex system works. They elicit causes, as causal factors, and how one causal factor is linked to another. So I decided when I was in Norway, this was a way to represent almost any problem. So why not use it for my assessment? This is the way a stock and flow diagram works. This is a formal mathematical representation in a visual form. But stocks are things that can be accumulated or depleted. Those are these square boxes. So there would be a formula that would show how the things that are connected to this stock influence its behavior. This is a flow, and this is a rate controlling the flow. So this is a very simple mathematical formalism called system dynamics for representing a complex system. It turns out it can represent almost any complex system. It's very powerful. There are a number of software tools that use this. Stella is one. PowerSim is the Norwegian version of this. There's a German version called VinSim. And it's a way to build an interactive simulation. It's a way to build a formal simulation model of a complex system. So before you get to this mathematical model, someone, the systems person, or the modeler, is going to talk to the domain expert to get to this level of representation. So they're going to work at this level. This is a higher aggregated level, and it's easier to understand. If you've never seen one of these, your eyes were hurting and your brow was wrinkled and you said, "Oh, shut up, Mike." This is easier to understand. You can grasp this, short words and arrows. So this is a causal loop diagram. The S means as there's a change in total workforce, there tends to be a change in the same direction of the people quitting the company. More people means more people are likely to quit. As more people quit, there will be a bigger gap in people that we need to hire. That's the workforce gap, change in the same direction. As we hire more people, that tends to reduce the gap, change in the opposite direction. So that's the O. The slash over here is a delay in the system. As we advertise more, we will hire more people, but there's a delay here. So this is a simple way to represent a very complex system. This is actually how system dynamics elicit knowledge. I thought, why not use this as an assessment methodology? So that was the driving factor behind. I've already said how I think about complex problems, and here's some examples. I did a research study on engineering design, medical diagnosis, and environmental planning were the three cases I looked at in the research study. There's a link to the tool I used. I've got some screen captures of the slides. So the idea was, how do we know that our interventions contribute to learning outcomes? And the idea was, we asked people to identify the key influence factors, show how they're related to each other, Then I asked two more questions. What assumptions did you make in creating this representation? And the fourth question is, what else would you need to know to solve this problem? I do that first for a group of experts in that domain. And I look to see, do the experts have a pattern? Do they identify similar factors, or they link together in a similar way? If the answer is yes, I have the basis for an assessment. Even though the experts may have different solutions, I don't care. They've identified similar factors. And that's how an expert thinks about that kind of problem. They think about these factors first. Then I look at newcomers to a domain. Do they identify the same factors? They don't. They identify, it's all over the place. And they link things up differently. So the difference between the novice and the expert representations forms the basis for analyzing progress of learning. It's not I'm getting better at solving that problem because they're not right and wrong answers, but I'm becoming more like an expert in the way I think about the problem. That turns out to be a promising methodology. Here's the tool, which is very, very simple. I didn't intend to build the tool when I started. I wanted to use an off-the-shelf tool. But every time I looked at a concept mapping tool, the learning curve was too long to use in a research study. So I had to build a tool inspired by DocuShare that somebody could learn in 2 minutes. So I've got two main things, nodes and links. And you can drop these here and connect nodes and annotate them over here and save your work. And that's all there was in this interface. A quick and dirty way to capture a representation of a problem. So I'll show you the problems in a minute. So here's a case where somebody has dropped some nodes and annotated the nodes. And what I found was that there were differences between experts and non-experts. The differences varied across domains. They actually varied with problems. But I could always identify an expert response from a non-expert response in the study. There was never a problem making that distinction. And there's been some related research that confirms this. This is an analysis of one of the, I had 15 novices and 5 experts in each of these cases responding to 2 problems. And here there's a difference in the average word per node. I can use that to pick out experts from novices. Experts were saying more about every node. There was a significant difference here. They had more to say about the nodes. But that's kind of superficial. This shows the kind of links that could be created. And there was a difference in the kinds of links created. It turns out this is the expert column, this is the novice column. Expert medical diagnosticians identified many more process links than did novices. This was a surprise to me when I was thinking naively about medical diagnosis. The reason was the diagnosticians, these were highly experienced medical practitioners, knew standard medical diagnosis procedures. And they saw the problem and they immediately applied the standard approved procedure. And those were represented as process steps. The novices were medical interns. They were in medical school. So they had to reason through how the body worked in order to reach the diagnosis. So they were identifying lots of causal links and not so many process links. So, but still, I could use that to distinguish novices from experts. Even more significant was what I called a node link cluster. These were key nodes that you can easily identify in a causal loop diagram. Experts, as I already said, almost always identified the same key nodes. And novices would identify different key nodes. Here's an example from the biology domain that showed, for example, that novices, their second most important node was human interaction in the environment. That doesn't show up in any of the expert solutions. When I talked to the experts about that, they said they took it for granted that social interaction and social awareness and human interaction would be important. So they were thinking at a completely different level. Again, it's a way to distinguish novices and experts. The most significant way is in terms of the connectedness of the causal loop diagram. So this strips away all meaning. So it turns out to be a very powerful predictor because I don't have to look at what was said about the nodes and links. I can look at how connected the diagram is. And this is an example of a highly connected causal loop diagram. there are no unreachable pairs. There's an in and out link to every node. And this one only has one terminal node, and because of that, these other 6 nodes are unreachable back to this one. So there's a minimal number of unreachable nodes and a minimal number of what I call terminal nodes, nodes with just a link going in one direction. This is an example of a novice response, highly disconnected. So, and this pattern shows up over and over and over again. So just the structure of the diagram is indicative of level of knowledge. So that's a very powerful finding. So that's a quick look at some research. And I'm going to end here, and I know I haven't left you much time for questions, but I'm going to end on this note of humility. We know less than we are inclined to believe. Right? So if I could leave my students with this belief, I feel like I've always accomplished things. There's some references at the end, but I invite your questions. I know I talk fast, and I tried to say too much. I welcome your questions. Yes?
Could you address a little bit more about the issue on equality in learning, e-learning environments?
Quality or equality?
Equality.
Equality.
Yeah, there's some students pretty slow learner,
Right.
and some underprivileged students who are poor could not access the environment or something like that.
Yeah, this is partly related to the digital divide issue, but also with regard to individual differences. It's an ethical issue in a way, because the idea in education is, the ideal in education is to provide the opportunity to everyone to lift themselves up, to build up their understanding of their world, and to have better opportunities.
From an educator's point of view, we are more concerned about those underprivileged students than those students who already have those advantages.
Yeah, you're well outside my domain of expertise, and all I can do is react. I support the ideal, but the realistic side of me says we live in a pretty competitive world. So students are always going to be seeking an advantage to get ahead. In the United States, we have laws that require us to support students with disabilities. So if you're at a public institution and you have any internet or technology-based learning, you have to follow the American Disabilities Act, which means you have to have text readers and web pages have to be in a certain format and so forth. It's minimal support for students with disabilities, I would say. It really doesn't do a lot. Those students have a huge disadvantage. There's a tradition that I don't know how much it's caught on in American schools to put students with disabilities in the same classrooms with other students. Part of that is a cultural issue, so that students who look and behave differently because of a disability aren't regarded as outsiders. From the early educational process, they're integrated into society, with their other peers. So I think that's a good movement. I don't know how wide, it was common practice at Syracuse. That's one of the places where it's called inclusion, where inclusion was, work was done. And it's common practice in Florida, but I don't know if it's everywhere. And I don't know if that happens in Taiwan. The issues with regard to poverty, I mean, there is the cost of access. And in the United States, internet access by way of a telephone line doesn't cost very much, but still $10 a month might be a lot for a poor family. But the real issue is it's $10 a month for a very low bandwidth, low speed connection, which means if you're going to have lots of graphics, audio, a rich multimedia learning system delivered in the home, you're not going to do it over a telephone line. It just doesn't work. So that becomes an issue. If you want to personalize instruction and address individual differences, then you have to have typically a rich multimedia environment. For students who learn better with audio, for example, that are weak readers, you're going to send an audio file across the line. And if it's a telephone line, it's going to be choppy and not very well received. So those are real issues. I don't have good solutions. Technology can support the solution, but it's society that really has to support the solution, not the technology. We have the technology to do all that stuff. It's the will of the society. Best I can do, sorry.
Any more questions?
Yeah, you mentioned the concept of atomic approach and holistic approach. Essentially, when we do a lecture in the individual training and the group training are totally different. And so, how do you find the main ethics or main differences in designing such e-learning program, and what would be the essential key idea?
Yeah. I support this notion of holistic learning because it's partly socially based, and all of the epistemology and research done with kids show that they're social learners. And it turns out how well they learn depends a lot on the level of their peers. So if you have a high-level peer group, you do well. If you think of this in terms of a sports team, if you're playing with another person who's performing at a higher level, you're raised up to that level of performance. So if you're in a game where you're making a pass to a really high-level performer, you can't make a bad pass to that person because he's going to catch it no matter where you throw it. So he's high level, and you begin to play better. So it's the group level that becomes important. And high performers in a group tend to raise the group up, all things being equal. Now, the thing that's not equal is personality issues. So high-level performers can be very arrogant and not supportive of a group. But if you have high performers, at least one in a group, who is a good group interaction person, that group is going to perform better than another group who might not have access to that person. So one of the design issues is group composition. So putting people at different levels in a group is typically a good thing. There are lots of other factors to consider. One of the factors is this personality issue. If the way the learning or psychologists talk about this is field-dependent and field-independent learner, or if you think about it as self-centered and other directed learners. So if you have only self-centered people in a group, you have a group that's dysfunctional. They're not going to share and exchange information. So from the instructor's point of view or the designer's point of view, you try and figure out who these people are, what kind of people are they, what do they already know, how do they interact with other people, and you strive for a heterogeneous group so you get a higher performing group. But I think the group composition is a critical issue. And again, it's not well-developed knowledge that we have about designing effective groups. If you just do random assignment, sometimes you get groups that work and sometimes you get groups that don't work. So spending time on...
Yeah, but I mean, the difference is that this is not related to the properties or the kind of specialization of the group, but how do you assess the influence between the group members?
In terms of grading I'm not...
Typically for e-learning, we are all personalized. Typically, we have very little chances to have the classroom, the e-learning. But you say the holistic approach is called...
my e-learning environments are not personalized, individualized. They always require group interaction.
Okay.
So I always have small group projects. But I teach in a domain where instructional designers become part of design teams. So when they go out into the workplace, they have to learn to function as a team member. So my notion, the simple-minded notion, is there should be transfer from the learning experience to the work experience. If the work experience is team-based, there ought to be a lot of team-based activities in the learning experience. So I make my students work on projects, and typically I like 3 people on a team. If you have more than 4 or 5, people are left out. And if you only have 2, one person is going to take control. Anyway, it varies. So I make people do small group projects, small group reports, engage in group discussions, and you can do that with most learning management systems. Am I getting to what you're after?
Yeah, I mean, if you have some kind of program, can you provide this kind of service, not corresponding to your hybrid learning or integrated learning?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking still.
Well, okay.
No, but push me, yeah, or press me later. I'm sorry for being so dense. I should understand better.
Innovation and creativity education are important issues now. So in your opinion, can e-learning support innovation education?
It was an interesting change in the traditional approach to learning objectives. If you know Bloom's taxonomy, some of you are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. It was revised by Krathwohl and Anderson around 2002, and creativity was added as a category and recognized as a legitimate learning objective. So I'm certainly not an expert in this area, but I would recommend the book by Krathwohl and Anderson because they have a whole section on how to address creativity as an instructional goal. That's a non-answer, but it's somebody else always has better ideas, and in this case, Krathwohl and Anderson did.
But what about teaching? You know, as a learner and educator, I found that I don't like to learn anything for it. You know, I like entertainment. You know, through entertainment, I found that youngsters, especially, they learn online gaming so fast. You know, is there a way to teach them? Academic-wise.
Yeah, that's actually that's a hot topic right now in the United States. Game-based learning. There's a number of research studies on this, and they tend to say that there's not good evidence that there's transfer from a game environment to a task environment. So people can learn to be good at a game, but there may be very marginal learning outcomes benefit in the workplace. But people are still fascinated with the idea. The time on task issue is great because if you have an entertaining game, kids will play and play and play and play. They'll spend a lot of time playing, and they do that. You're right. So the notion is if we could somehow capture that time on a learning task through a game, there should be a benefit. And I think there would be a benefit, but I haven't seen it happen. The notion of a game is different than a simulation. A simulation really attempts to model a real-world task. So the notion of transfer is more likely to occur. A game may be based on a simulation, but in a game, the notion of competition and entertainment take over, or more prominent than the notion of transfer to a task. There is a kind of game called a management flight simulator, where some of this transfer does occur. So the SimCity environment, those kind of things are game-like, but there may be some learning happening. Not good evidence yet, but the idea is definitely interesting and is being pursued by a number of researchers. Prinsky's book may be in my bibliography at the end. Is one place. He supports the notion of games. And that Serious Games site I mentioned before, there's too much stuff to look at. You could start now and spend the rest of your life and not have read it all. And of course, by then, there would be exponentially more stuff added.
Obviously, there are a lot of research in e-learning in this area. But down to the practical issue, a lot of researchers, they are frustrated in applying information technology in the school. Yes, so what's the situation in the United States?
Yeah, that's a good question. How to make it work in the schools. I haven't worked that much in the schools. I do have a project right now in rural schools in the southeastern part of the United States, Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. Rural meaning poorly performing, poor economically, not doing very well. The situation in those schools in the United States is they actually have a lot of technology, probably better technology than big city schools, because people have been giving it to them. And historically, this has been going on for years and years and years. The problem is, and the teachers turn out to be highly motivated in these rural communities. The teaching job in a rural community in the United States is the best job you can have. It's permanent. It pays steady money, not a lot, but compared to a farmer, or a farm worker, it pays a lot of money. So the teachers are well paid, highly motivated. The classes are smaller than big city classes, but the teachers aren't specialized. So they're not prepared to deal with the technology. They may not have a technology coordinator. They may not have a reading specialist. They may not have a disabilities person. So they have to do double duty. And so they end up with a lot of technology that's still in boxes. Or if it's unpacked, it's not being used. Or if it's unpacked and put in a laboratory, it's being used in an unsupervised manner because the teachers haven't had the time to learn how to use the technology effectively. So it's the teacher knowledge about how to integrate the use of technology into their everyday teaching that's the missing element. And that's my experience in those rural schools in the United States. So that's why I had a slide there that said we're leaving teachers behind. This happened with the logo, so-called logo revolution, when logo was introduced. It was a great success in the lab environment, and then when they took logo, this programming environment, you know, logo with the turtles and kids move them around and create simulations with logo. Wonderful. But teachers had no idea how to do this. They weren't trained in the use of logo. It failed miserably in the classroom, even though in the lab it was a marvelous success. We didn't support the teachers properly. We didn't train the teachers properly. That's the lesson, I think, of the logo in the 1980s experience. I don't know if that answers it. Teacher support, teacher training is absolutely critical.
We have another speech after the break. So if you have questions, then you can ask at the end of the second speech.
And you have my email if you think of something later. Email. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your questions.
那各位就是嘉宾，我们在1楼有准备一些小点心以及茶水供大家使用。那希望大家在1楼用完之后，如果有需要。
Prestigious SSCI journals, and according to our survey, that Taiwanese researchers perform very well in ET&S and in teaching and learning, and computer and education, computers in human behavior, but perform not very well in the ET&S. So we invite Dr. Spector to come here to have some suggestion of how to do research, and so that we can even perform better, and we can have more contribution to the academic, especially in United States related journals. So let's welcome Dr. Spector to give us a very good speech at making educational research count. Please welcome Dr. Spector.
I can talk to you, so okay, thanks, Professor Chen. So most of you were here, I think, for the first talk. So this one's going to be a little bit different. So I really encourage you to interrupt along the way. So I like things that are get sidetracked and are unstructured. Oops. I didn't need to press there. So again, my picture is a different view of Taipei and the stadium. These are the topics I thought I would talk about here. But I can talk about anything related to publishing or research as you like. I'm the editor of the development section of ETRD, as Professor Chen said. And the way that happened was by accident. It's an elected position. The journal is sponsored by the Association for Educational Communications and Technologies. There are two sections to the journal, a research section. Steve Ross is the editor of the research section and the development section. And historically, this journal emerged as a result of two journals being put together. The Journal of Instructional Development became integrated with the Journal of Educational Technology Research. And when they merged some 20 years ago, it became ETR&D. So there have always been two editors as a result of that initial merger. It's somewhat complicated for people submitting to the journal because they don't often, or sometimes they don't know, should they submit to the research section or to the development section, because it's a research journal and both sections take research-oriented papers. So what we tell people is don't worry about it. If you send a paper to Steve Ross and it belongs in the development section, he'll send it to me, and vice versa, I'll send it to him. The development section is really about research that pertains to the instructional planning and implementation processes. If that's the focus. If there's implications of the research for the design or development of instruction, it should be in the development section. The research is mainly on learning outcomes, but no implications for design and development. Then it belongs in the research side. But again, it's hard to distinguish. And as I said, the positions are elected by the board of editors. And each section of the journal has 6 people serve on the editorial board. I used to review for the research section for years and years and years, and every 3 years there's an election for the editor. And on the research side, Steve Ross would ask, are there any nominations for the editor? And no one wanted to do it. So, because it's a lot of work and there's no reimbursement. I mean, this is a professional service. So, and I knew that from having been on the research section for so long. And so everybody was happy for Steve to continue being the editor. On the development side, there has been more of an interest in having new people there because I think basically there are new developments in terms of design and development processes. So we've had a number of editors. Before me, Jim Klein was the editor for 6 years. And after his second term, he said, that's enough, we want someone else. And basically, no one else wanted to do it. So I was recruited from the research section of the journal to move over to the development section, and I was elected the editor about 4 or 5 years ago. So I've been the editor for that length of time. It's an interesting task, being the editor of a journal. I don't know if anyone else here edits a journal. But for me, it took about 2 years to learn how to do this job. It's a peer-reviewed journal, so I take this idea real seriously. As the editor, my job is basically to find out if the people who are the reviewers think an article is worth publishing. They make the publication decisions, not me, not the editor. Peer-reviewed means your peers think this is ready for publication or not. And if not, they might say it's not ready for a number of reasons, or they don't think it's ever likely to be ready for this journal. Maybe it belongs in another journal. So my main task are finding the reviewers who are qualified to review the paper. And then if they happen to disagree, typically we have 3 reviewers, then I have some role to arbitrate if there's a disagreement. On the research side, it turns out there are very few disagreements. Steve has a much easier task. On the development side, because design and development is much more open-ended and research is messier, the kind of research we do, there is very often disagreement among the reviewers. So it turns out to be a very time-consuming effort, but it's been interesting. I have another year to think about if I'm going to do it a third time or not, so I appreciate your feedback. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about some of those things I've learned along the way being the editor of ETR&D, but then I'm also interested in higher level things. One of the things that hasn't come out in the introduction about my background is I'm not trained in educational psychology or instructional technology or computer science. I've worked as a computer scientist. I've done instructional design work and educational research. But my formal training, my PhD is in philosophy and epistemology. So I don't know if that's come through any of the remarks I've been saying, but it might come through again in some of the remarks I'm saying now. So one of my philosophy professors when I was in graduate school, back when the Earth was created 50 years ago, and at the University of Texas in Austin is where I went to graduate school, there was a professor there who would ask this question occasionally of his graduate students. Why are you doing what you're doing? So I asked my graduate students the same question. Why do this? Why bother doing it? Are you going to make a difference in the world? Will the world be a better place because of the research or development that you do? What will come from what we're doing today or tomorrow? So what does this look like when it's put in? So if this question grabs your mind, I mean, it could be that we're just fascinated by the technology, or we wanted to have summers off. In the United States, that's why people become teachers, right? So we can go hike in the mountains in the summer. That's actually why I became a teacher. I was, really. I mean, I was naive when you're, what do you know when you're 17? I mean, not a lot. But so, you grow up and the world changes. So really, now we take our lives more seriously. So what does it mean? What difference will we make as educational researchers? So Gagne, some of you, how many of you have heard of Bob Gagne? You know this name? So there are some of you. He's no longer alive, but he was considered when he was alive the most influential educational researcher, instructional design researcher in the world. And he published a book called Conditions of Learning that went through 4 different editions, published in 80 some odd languages. It's a Florida State professor. And I had the privilege to work with him when I was doing research for the Air Force. But he said a number of times in a number of different ways that the point of educational research, the point of instruction, in fact, was to help people learn better. So if we weren't doing that, we weren't doing our jobs. And so he thought that was a burden. So establishing that we're helping people learn better is the task of educational research. How do we show that we're making a difference? So that's the way I think about the business of educational research. I'm going to say a few things about how I think about research. It may be differently than how you think about research, which is okay. I'll be curious to hear differences. But the basic question in research that I see is a lot of strange things happen in your life. Why do they happen the way they do? Why did it happen this way as opposed to some other way? Why do things happen the way they do? We can think about objects of research, and they might be events happen. Why does it get dark in the sky? If you think of people living a couple thousand years ago and not understanding an eclipse. Why did the moon go dark? What's going on here? So that would be a phenomenon or an event that needs explanation. Why does that happen? So there's a key point here. They don't understand why this event happens the way it does. We can talk about research not only in terms of objects, but in terms of methods. Typically, there should be some systematic way of investigating something that other people would recognize as legitimate. So that's the notion I take about a research method. So it's not just my research. My colleagues will recognize this method is reasonable and my findings is reasonable because I've followed an established methodology. That will distinguish us from some other areas. That gives us two key points of departure. And I ended my last talk with one of these. We are inclined to think we know more than we do. Remember that from that last slide? So one point is humility. An investigation begins because we admit that we do not understand something. So understanding the phenomena is the point of departure. And if you admit that you don't understand it, then that implies that you're open to other explanations. that there might not be one answer, that you want to investigate possible answers to this thing you don't understand. So that's the scientific attitude. That's what I regard as fundamental to scientific attitude. We don't teach this stuff in America. My students don't ever get this. So I don't know if you have a philosophy of science class that's required. It's not required here. In Norway, if you get a PhD at the University of Bergen, there's one required course and only one required course for all PhD students. It's a philosophy of science course. And that's the only course you have to take to get a PhD in Norway. Everything else is up to you. So and this is the essence of that philosophy of science course, in my mind. You can think differently, of course. So humility and openness. Just keep pressing the buttons. Of course you don't succeed. Mash that button again. Okay, so now if we think about the objects of research, we can think about what kinds of things help people learn. The objects could be the learning materials, or the object, the point, or the focus of research could be the people, the learners. So there could be different objects involved in that question, what helps people learn. If we really want to focus on what makes some things difficult to learn, again, the object could be the thing to be learned, or the object could be the individual learner. What is it about this learner that makes it difficult for this learner to understand that problem? It might be a learner with disabilities that has dyslexia or dyscalculia, and so they have a problem solving a certain kind of problem or reading a certain kind of statement. The object could be the instructional strategies. So this is what instructional designers are most interested in, and of course that's a key concern to ETR&D. Which strategies and which technologies are effective to support particular learners and particular learning goals. And then a basic question, because learning is about change, is what would happen if we change something in the instruction? So those are different kinds of questions, different categories, different ways to talk about the objects. And now I'm going to have something to say about methods. I haven't picked exactly the right words. This is one of those slides I changed last night. You probably do this too when you make a presentation, keep changing it, and if I do this again, I'll probably change it again. The word that I'm not happy with here is empirical. And I did want to repeat qualitative and quantitative methods are typically the distinction. But what I wanted to distinguish would be something called traditionally empirical in the sense of scientific inquiry. Empirical from a philosophical perspective means based on observation rather than based on deductive reasoning. Right? So that would be the pure meaning for empirical. But I'm using it here to say methodologies can be empirical in the scientific tradition, means a group of people can make observations, use recognized methods, and achieve similar conclusions. So that's sort of a community observation. There's a community standard for the observation. So that's what I mean by traditionally empirical methods. And those are the kinds that are typically regarded in the United States and in a lot of research journals as the preferred methods. But they're not the only methods, and ETR&D actually accept both kinds of methods. So traditional empirical methods would be cases where there's a testable outcome, you can replicate the findings, you might have a controlled experimental study with random assignment of students, large numbers of people involved. That's ideal because that's sort of the scientific gold standard and other people could repeat it. It turns out educational research is pretty messy. And if you're doing research in schools, then you can hardly ever do the traditional empirical methodologies. So other methods are acceptable. And descriptive exploratory studies are especially acceptable. Descriptive studies, if you're doing case studies in schools, you'll be limited in how you can generalize the findings, but at least you can describe what happens in a particular case. And if you have a collection of cases that a number of people have conducted over a period of time, then you might be able to establish the basis for some cause and effect relationships. But typically, the non-traditional methods don't get to cause and effect. Right? But they can be useful to figure out what factors are likely to be most influential in a particular area. This is a slide taken from what I regard as one of the best research books in instructional design theory. Charlie Reigeluth's 1983 Instructional Design Theories and Models book. And I don't know if you've seen this, but this is from the first chapter of that book. And he lays out a distinction between research in psychology, or the psychology of learning, and instructional design research. So in general, there are three factors that affect, that can be related. The conditions in which learning is occurring, and that would involve characteristics about the learner as well as the learning environment. The particular methods involved in learning, and that could involve, should involve the technology, expository, lecture-like delivery versus experiential practice, problem solving with simulations, lots of different methodologies. And then outcomes, that's the change. What do learners know now and are able to do now that they couldn't do before? So those three things are related. The way that learning theory research, the way that psychology research works is it's descriptive, but it can be, and it's typically quantitative, but they will take a set of conditions as input variables and a set of methods as the input variables and describe what the outcomes are in that circumstance. That's descriptive research for the psychology of learning. And people do that kind of research. That kind of research would get published in educational psychology journals, typically, not in ETR&D. ETR&D is more concerned with what happens if we have a desired outcome and we manipulate the instructional conditions. What would be the effect, what would be the implication for the optimal method to achieve that outcome given this set of constraints? That would be instructional design research. So we're looking at implications for design. What are the likely methods if we have these desired outcomes and this set of constraints? So instructional design research is really an optimizing kind of research. It's prescriptive research. It suggests the kinds of things that you ought to consider doing given certain constraints and circumstances. Does that distinction make sense? Because that's really fundamental. So ETR&D is more interested in this kind of research. Some of the educational psychology research would end up in Steve Ross's section of the journal, but the development section would be primarily over here. If that's worthwhile, and I highly recommend that book. He's published a 99 volume. It's much thicker. Both of these are green books, and they're called the green books by instructional design researchers. But the 83 book is much, much better. This is common with scientists. They do their best work when they're young. Right? Reigeluth is probably Dave Merrill's most distinguished student. He's still alive and well at Indiana University. Given that distinction, there are a number of kinds of research studies you can do. And ETR&D will accept all four of these kinds of studies. You can have a general article of developing a conceptual framework based on previous work in an area. It might be a conceptual framework that's based on expert comments or focus group discussions. So that would be a conceptual paper. You could do a descriptive study or conduct a survey. For example, there are a couple of these that have been published about educational curriculum for educational technologists, and they typically are descriptive and survey studies. You can do formal evaluation studies, and this is a challenging kind of research. So you develop a product. It could be an e-learning product, for example, and you conduct what's called a formative evaluation. So you want to see what the effect of using this product is, and there's a strong tradition for this kind of research in human factors and computer science areas as well. They don't typically call it formative evaluation. It might be called beta testing. Alpha and beta testing is what I remember way back when I used to do computer science. But the idea is you'll have a product that's developed, and the point of a formative evaluation is to improve the product. So the idea of a beta test, if you have a new product and intervention and you do a comparative analysis of the outcomes. So that's the fourth kind of paper that we publish. And probably the fewest we get are the formative evaluations. We get more of the formal research, descriptive research, and maybe some conceptual papers. These are hard to write, general articles based on expert positions. So we get several of these submitted. We get a lot of these submitted every year, but the rejection rate is probably the highest for that category at EQR&D, just because they're really hard to write. You have to do a good literature review. You have to have sound, coherent interviews with experts if it's based on expert positions, and then you have to have a framework. And ideally, you can show implications for future research. So, any questions or comments on those as we go along? Yeah.
Right. In the previous speech, you mentioned system dynamics.
Right.
Okay. Well, I have just a clue now, thinking that the system dynamics could be a method.
Right. Absolutely.
Descriptive approach. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, that was it? Yeah. No, that's how I think about system dynamics. Would be a way to structure an intervention. The intervention, I mean, it would be a method. It would be the methodology would be interactive simulation. Would be the methodology, and the underlying technology for that methodology would be system dynamics.
So it's good to both approaches.
Sure. Yeah, and we've had a couple, not so much in EQR&D, but we've had one concept paper. One of the concept papers published at EQR&D recently was by David Jonathan, who talked about a system dynamics-based intervention. The article was about problem-based learning, and he talked about complex problems and how to promote learning with very complex ill-structured problems. Interactive simulations was a good intervention methodology. So there was a conceptual paper.
Is there a set of elements for system dynamics analysis?
What was the
especially for instruction learning, or a set of elements?
A set of elements
for the analysis. To my knowledge, system dynamics, we have to have those elements. Okay. In education studies, there's a set, some standard sets of elements.
Yeah,
stock and flow,
No. Yeah, it would depend on the problem that you're addressing. The stocks and flows, a particular system dynamics diagram would be problem dependent. You create it to fit the problem. If that's what you're asking. There's some interesting ways to think about that. If you're following this question, how do you structure research? If you have suppose it's a chemical engineering course, and maybe you want to help engineers design a certain kind of environment for distilling a fluid or doing something, and you have different design decisions that can be made. So you can build a simulation that reflects design decisions for that environment. And you can, and then run the simulation and have learners manipulate parts of the design decision in that simulation. But all of the stock and flows for that would be dependent on that particular distillery environment. So you're making a fluid, there are optimal ways, heat you're going to control in the flow of the liquid and how long it stays at a certain temperature, all of those kinds of things you manipulate in the simulation, and then you get some outcome. You ask students for, what's an effective way to design this distillery. Maybe it minimizes the cost of electricity to run the plant, or optimizes the time to produce the liquid, or some other variable. And they can do a simulation to learn those kinds of things. So the intervention would be simulation. Okay, so now suppose that was a learning task, and if that's a rough enough idea, I just made that stuff up. I'm not a chemical engineer. So we have something like that. We build an environment, and we know that the simulation really reflects the real world. We've done some kind of validation. So the model is reflective of the way things would behave in the real world. You want to do an analysis, does this promote learning? So there are a number of things you could do. You could do a comparative analysis. You say, okay, well, the way we've been teaching this is with this textbook and this set of lectures and the test we gave at the end, and we've done this for 20 years, and we actually have all of the test results for 20 years. We can now replace that with this simulation-based learning experience and give students the same test that the students got for 20 years and see if they perform better or worse. I know of a study that was done like this with aeronautical engineering at the Air Force Academy. And I actually went to the Air Force Academy as an undergraduate, and I took the first year aeronautical engineering course, which was taught textbook, memorize the formulas, you get a test, you remember the right formula, plug the numbers in, and get the answers. And I got an A and didn't learn anything. But the Air Force Academy kept the data for 30 years, and they decided that they were going to change the course to be a simulation-based course. So all of the problems for the entire semester would be built around designing an engine, an aircraft engine. And they did a comparative analysis of the study. And what happened was, and they gave students the same test that I took 20 years earlier as the outcome measure. And the result was no significant difference based on the interactive simulation. But there was another outcome that was significant. So this turned out to be a very good study, even though there's no significant difference. People, according to that outcome measure, knowledge test, they didn't learn any more with the simulation-based environment than they did with the classroom lectures. The difference was, at the Air Force Academy, the goal was to have all students major in aeronautical engineering. And the typical thing that happened would be what happened to me. They take the first aeronautical engineering course, they hate the class, and they change their major to something else. So I became a major in philosophy and psychology. So there was a huge attrition rate for aeronautical engineering majors. No significant difference in learning outcome with the simulator-based course, but people retained the major. So that was a significant difference. And the idea, if you have this sustained time on task over a period of time, now if you take the second and the third and the fourth aeronautical engineering course, you're going to learn a lot, and people will become aeronautical engineers. So that was a huge outcome. Comparative analyses are okay, and that turns out to be one of the best I've seen. A better way to do it is to have a better outcome learning measure than the knowledge-based test. And what I talked about in that last lecture, the concept mapping exercise, are people really understanding the critical factors and solving design problems, aeronautical design or chemical engineering design problems. Then that's also a good way to conduct a study. And then you don't have to have a control group or a comparison group.
Interesting. One
Yes.
question is the system dynamics in educational research described in terms of a rule-based kind of system, or differential equation or difference equation or any other kind?
The method, well, I'm not, what was,
How do you describe the system dynamics?
the methodology itself, the mathematics of it is based on differential equations. So you have to have a formal representation of a system. So in terms of educational research, I mean, then you can say, let's say, well, we have a lot of money. This is Taiwan. You're a rich country. We hire somebody to build the system dynamics, to do all of the mathematics of this, to create a formal system. So, and from an educational research point of view, what we would care about is, does the simulation behave the way the real-world system would occur? It's a representation of a real-world system. So we want transfer of learning to occur. And if the learning experience, if the decisions and actions I take in the simulator are unrelated to what I would do in the real world, probably not much transfer of learning. So we want the simulation to be valid. Right? And there is a formal way to establish validity. The guy that does this is Yaman Barlas, a Turkish professor. And the methodology is based on getting a mathematical representation of a complex system. So somebody does that. Somebody has to do it. I'm not an expert in building. And building those, I'm an expert, maybe not an expert, but I know a little bit about evaluating them. Am I getting to? your concern?
There's a kind of fuzzy model in the system dynamics.
System dynamics, all of the tools allow for fuzzy logic. So I know PowerSim has fuzzy variables. Yeah. Yeah. And I assume Stella and Vincent do also. Because they're competitive. They keep doing whatever the other one does. So PowerSim was the first to have a web-based interaction, so you could have people interacting with the simulation at different locations. And then Stella and Vincent caught up, and they do the same thing. It's software business. Yeah. That's an interesting world. There's a nice website for using system dynamics in education at MIT. There's a system dynamics education project at MIT. It has a huge amount of material available. If you just did a search on SDEP at MIT, you would find it. The methodology was invented by Jay Forrester, who's a professor at MIT. Some general principles of research is try to pose empirical questions. Empirical in the sense I'm using this. That they're based on observations that a group of people could make using methodologies of observation and analysis that a group would accept. So that's my sense of empirical. It's nice to link the research to previous theory, and we make our graduate students do this when they write dissertations. They have to have a literature review section. So typically a journal article will have a very small link to previous literature section. It might be 2 paragraphs instead of 20 pages. But there should be some link to relevant theory. If you can directly investigate something, that's good. I talked earlier about mental models. They're not directly observable. So you can't investigate a mental model, not even your own mental model, because that's hidden from your view, not directly accessible. What you can directly investigate is the concept map, the external representation of the mental model. So that's what you investigate. And don't make claims about the mental model. Make claims only about what's in plain view, the concept map. That's my advice. I'm an old-time kind of person with regard to that scientific approach. Try and provide a coherent chain of reasoning, and it's okay to replicate another study. Some journals won't publish a replication of a previous study. ETR&D will do that. And if you find the same thing, that's still okay. That's worth knowing, and it's worth telling the scientific community, that study that so-and-so did 20 years ago, I ran the same study using the same method. Of course, it would be a different group of learners. And I found, very similar results. That's a good thing for doctoral students, in fact, to do. And you can get it published in some journals. ETRD is one. ETS, Education, Technology, and Society, is another journal that will publish that kind of research. Not all journals will do that. Some journals want, completely new stuff. Don't replicate what's been done before. In education, that's a stupid position, I think, not to replicate, because there's so much variability in educational research. The instructors, the learning environment is different. The learners are different. There are claims that people in the Y generation, I can't even keep up with X, Y, and Z generation, but that generation is different. Research doesn't show that, by the way. But it's okay to conduct research as if there would be a difference, replicate a previous study, and then report the findings. If you have no significant difference, to me, that's a significant finding. ETRD will publish studies with no significant difference. A lot of journals will not do that. APA journals, American Psychological Association journals, won't publish no significant findings. They won't publish replication studies, and they won't publish anything that's been published on the web, even if it's on your personal website. If it's ever been on the web, they won't touch it. ETRD is not so uptight as that. And my view is finding no significant difference is worth telling the world about. It doesn't matter if there's no significant difference between an e-learning sequence and a lecture sequence. In fact, that's worth knowing because there could be other advantages to the e-learning sequence. So why not publish that outcome? That's a good thing to do. And ETRD will support that. This last one is, of course, you want it to be subject to professional scrutiny. And the way to do that, it's it's not on this slide, but somewhere, is to present at a conference and then get feedback, and then you've actually got the scrutiny built in before you send it to a journal. This slide is how to develop a research agenda. I mean, this varies a lot. I mean, you have this e-learning, long-term e-learning program, so you've identified a number of issues. In my research, what I think is the deep, persistent problem is we don't have a way to measure progress of learning with regard to ill-structured problems. So we don't know if any of our interventions, any of our methods, actually contribute to learning because we don't have good measures. We don't have a methodology for doing that. So I've been working on that problem. And there are a couple other people that work on that. Norbert Zell, a German educational psychologist, does that kind of work. Harry O'Neill at UCLA does that kind of research, and Roy Clariana, and maybe there are 2 or 3 other people. So there's a community of people that do that kind of research. The likely impact of that research is all of the curriculum that are aimed at ill-structured problems, design curriculum, including instructional design curriculum, would be, there would be implications from that research. And then pick a path and interim goals and interim studies along the way. And if you have graduate students, they're the workers, and they're going to get publications from this, and they do a piece of it, and the next graduate cohort comes in and they do another piece, and you build piece upon piece upon piece. In my domain, one way that I could have gone was to pick, let's say, medical diagnosis, because there's a lot of funding for medical research. So I could pick one domain, do the concept mapping assessment methodology in that domain with a series of studies, and then generalize to another domain, and then to another domain, and have students work on that. That would have been one path. Probably I would have got more money if I'd done that. Yeah, this is the slide where do a presentation first, because you're going to get feedback. You're going to give me feedback, so the next time if I give this talk again, probably never again, but if I give it again, some of you are going to make comments about, I didn't understand that so well. The questions actually indicate things to me that I didn't make clear, I would do differently. But you'll get feedback when you do a presentation. It's the same thing when you're a learner. If you put yourself out and ask a question, you're going to remember what happened. And if you think it's a stupid question, you should ask it anyway, because you're going to learn from the answer. So if you think, well, I have this point of view that maybe it's not going to be so well received, my view is this old style way of thinking about scientific research is robust, and we ought not abandon it. I've presented that to you. You can tell me that, Mike, you're out of date, you're old, retire and go to bed. But, and somebody will, probably. But so I have to put myself out there, get feedback. And then, okay, a little bit on the particular publications alluded to. How much time have I got? I've got to figure out how fast I should go. 20 minutes? Okay, thanks. Picking the journal makes a difference. The gold standard is what's called a double-blind peer-reviewed journal. Double-blind means that the reviewers don't find out who the author is. It's not revealed. They may figure it out, and oftentimes you can do that. And they also don't know who the other reviewers are. And the author, of course, doesn't know who the reviewers are. So that's double-blind. If I'm reviewing, I review for a lot of journals in addition to being an editor. Not all journals are double-blind. Not all good journals are double-blind peer-reviewed. Instructional Science is a very good journal, but the reviewers find out who the author is. So that's strange to me, but that's a good journal that violates this general principle. Very good journal. But they don't find out who the other reviewers are. But ETR&D, the reviewers don't know the author, they don't know the other reviewers, and of course the authors don't know the reviewers. And it's not required to be indexed in SSCI, but of course most of the journals are like that. The way reviewers work, I've talked to a lot of reviewers, they typically do this. There's variations, of course, but a lot of reviewers will read the abstract. They might read the first couple paragraphs in the introduction, and then they go to the reference section. And they go to the reference section for two reasons. One is to figure out who the author is, and they can typically do that from the references. And the other is it gives them an indication of the quality of the paper. If the reference section is not formatted carefully, the reviewer forms the impression this is not a writer with experience. So the quality of the formatting of the reference section makes a difference with reviewers. Maybe it shouldn't be that way, but it is that way. So, and often the reviewers, I've had reviewers ask me, did so-and-so write this paper? And of course I can't tell them yes or no. And most of the time when they ask that question, they're exactly right. They know who the author was, even though it's blind, because they can tell from their references. It's either that person or that person's graduate student wrote this paper. But that's okay. It's still blind. We don't let people know. There are sometimes for academic advancement, you don't get credit for, typically, I don't know in Taiwan, but in the United States, you don't get credit for publishing in a trade journal. Educational Technology would be a trade journal. Some of you have seen it. Larry Lipsitz is the editor of that one. Tech Trends is another one. Elizabeth Bowling is the editor of that one. Those journals actually have a huge readership and high impact. So if that question of conscience, what have I done that's going to make the world better, is bothering you, then instead of thinking of personal career advancement, you might think about contribution to the discipline, and a trade journal is a legitimate place to publish for that reason. You can impact practice. So professional practitioners read Educational Technology, and you'll have a lot of readers. You won't get any tenure and promotion credits, at least in the United States, but it's worth considering. I don't know if you see that journal or not. So, any of you read Educational Technology? What's that? What does that mean? I went too fast on the slides? No. Okay. Here's a long list of journals where you might consider publishing, all the way down to simulation and gaming. These are refereed journals. Not all of them are indexed in SSCI, but they're all pretty good journals. These last three are three more trade magazines. Syllabus and the journal would be for teachers. You'll reach a lot of teachers using technology if you put an article in there. Tech Trends is AECT's trade journal. And then Educational Technology, well, I put up here, it really belongs down here. It's not refereed. I can tell you about some of these because if you want to hear any of this, comments on these. But it sounds like you know about some of these. Computers and Human Behavior has been around for a long time. It's a double-blind, peer-reviewed journal. Bob Tennyson is the editor. He's in the University of Minnesota and the College of Education. It's a very good journal, very high impact rating because it reaches a broad population of computer scientists, human factors engineers, educational technologists. So the broader the audience, the higher the impact rating for the journal, if that's of concern to you. That one would be higher than ETRD because ETRD reaches a very narrow community, small user population, if you like, or research population. Distance Education, there are two of these journals. I don't know if I listed them separately or not, but one is edited by Som Naidu in Australia, and the other one's edited by Michael Moore. And both of those in e-learning, that would be a place where you could publish. And both of these journals, most of these journals publish the same kinds of research that ETRD does. Conceptual papers are okay, research studies, formal research studies, qualitative research studies, and formative evaluations would be okay for any of these. Educational Computing Research is a journal by the Association for Academic, AACE. What is AACE? Association for the Academic Computers and Education? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So that's one of their journals. They have about a half dozen journals, actually. And that's one place you might publish. Educational Researcher is more for the educational psychology people. That's a journal from American Educational Research Association. Very large readership, high impact factor. And they also publish conceptual papers, lots of conceptual papers, and educational researchers. EdTech I mentioned is Larry Lipsitz journal, a trade journal with a huge readership. Educational Technology Review, ETR&D, these are very similar. Education, Technology, and Society is, in my mind, the best online peer-reviewed journal that I know about. So the editor is Ken Shook, recently moved to Athabasca University in Canada from Massey University in New Zealand. It's peer-reviewed. It's an online journal, which means fast turnaround time. If you want to get your work out fast, that's a good place to go. And you have a special issue coming up next year in EPS, I think, right? So, yeah. 2009, year after next, yeah. Is that far out, really? Okay, yeah. Yeah, so, and that also has a lot of readers, and it's available online and archived online. So it's available to a lot of people. So there are a lot of nice things about ETS. Evaluation and Program Planning is a journal sponsored by the American Evaluation Association. And program planning papers, you have this 5-year plan for e-learning in Taiwan. A paper doing some kind of evaluation study of that program would be ideal for evaluation and program planning. Johnny Morrell is the editor of that journal. I'm on the editorial board of that one, and a number of the other ones as well. It's a very highly regarded journal. Computing in higher education, there's a couple of these I don't know so much about, but if you're doing research in university settings, those next 3 journals would be relevant. If you're looking at social computing, this journal would be a good place to go. If you're looking at adult workers in the workplace, Performance Improvement Quarterly is sponsored by the International Society for Performance Improvement. It's a good journal, been around for a long time. It's published at Florida State University by the Learning Systems Institute. It's about to be moved to another publisher. That would be a place, if you're looking at adult learners in the workplace, that would be a nice place to publish. Review of Research and Education is another AERA, high impact factor. And then if you're doing simulations and games, the premier journal in that area is called Simulation and Gaming. David, what's his name? Is he got, I can't pull it out of my mind. But some of you may have read Simulation and Gaming. That reaches a lot of different people also. That reaches computer scientists, educational technologists, system dynamicists, lots of people. So that's a quick overview of where you might publish. Writing tips, I'll do this and maybe not say too much more. I'm going to skip some slides here. And just in terms of writing style, because there's so many places to publish, it really helps to know who the readers are. So, because you can structure the paper differently for different readers. So be sure when you submit a paper that you follow the format that's required by the journal, and that you're familiar with how much literature review you need to provide for a particular area. ETR&D readers know the literature really well with regard to learning theory, for example, and instructional design theory. So minimal mention of previous work, previous theory, is all that's needed. But if you were publishing that same kind of paper in one of those other journals where the readers might not be familiar with Reigeluth's 1983 book, then you might have to talk more about instructional design theory. So, with regard to writing style, this is what I advise my students. This is probably you don't need to know this, but American students don't write well. My Norwegian students wrote better English than Americans, right? But for some reason, American students end up thinking to be published in a good academic journal, you have to write long, complicated sentences. Well, what happens is they're not comprehensible. Nobody can read and understand this. And reviewers are going to look at this. And reviewers are busy people. And if they don't understand what you're saying, you're going to get a bad review. To get a better review, simple language works better. It works better with readers, and it really works better with reviewers. The reviewers are basically the top people in the field, and they're all really busy people. So, and they're volunteering their time. So make the story understandable. Simple language, direct statements, minimal use of extra modifiers. That's a really hard skill to learn, and everybody can improve their writing. One of the most prolific people in our field is David Jonasson. I don't know if you've seen his work. But he'll submit a paper. He publishes in a number of journals. So I'll get a paper from Jonasson. The feedback, first time, almost always will be major revisions required. And there will be red ink all over the paper. Not red ink, but lots of comments and stuff from the reviewers. And Jonasson's attitude is, wonderful. That's great feedback. And he takes all of the feedback, rewrites the paper, submits it, and the second time, it's almost always accepted. But he gets the feedback, he pays attention to the feedback, and he revises. Most people, if they get major revisions required and there's comment after comment, 200 comments, say, oh my God, I'm never submitting to ET and R&D again. Their reviewers are terrible. But really, they spend a lot of time reading your paper, so take advantage of their comments. I'm going to skip those examples. This is another philosophy thing. Have we been doing stuff in educational technology that really contributes to improved learning and performance? Probably not. Oops, I want to go back to that slide and then do the next one. One of the things we've been doing in educational technology is promising too much. So we've been saying that, okay, we'll have this wonderful new technology, and if you just use my technology, I can create 2 standard deviations of improvement in test scores. It never happens. I mean, it never even happens that we get 1 standard deviation. Some intelligent tutoring systems in the 1980s and the 1990s got 1 standard deviation improvement in performance if they were in very well-defined domains, like simple programming problems or simple math problems. And that's the best we've ever done. Typically, we get no significant difference. But there are other kinds of things that can happen. So we overpromise, and we've been doing it for 50 years. It's time to be more realistic in terms of better learning outcomes, improved access to education, more equity of learning. Those kinds of things are more reasonable promises, and they're, in some cases, easier to measure. Here's a website I just want you to know about. This is the Learning Development Institute. Jan Visser has a huge archive of materials developed over about a 10 years period of time. And these are problems, it's called the Book of Problems. So educational research problems, questions whose answer we do not know. Visser got together about a dozen researchers, top people in the field. David Perkins is one, and these were his questions, and asked them to give him 10 problems that they didn't know the answer to that research was worth addressing. So if you're thinking about a research agenda, what questions are worth asking, this is a place that you might want to visit. This is a good website to go to. This is also, I was talking to somebody about the learning objects and the break. This is the website where the learning objects papers from AERA, I think in 2004, are archived at this website. But I highly encourage you to go to learndev.org and take a look at 2002. And oops, that didn't work the way it was supposed to. So I was supposed to leave time for questions, right? Did I come close to doing that?
Any questions? Can we talking about the formal evaluation? So if you have the size of the population,
Oh.
the
Yeah. It depends on the sequence. That's a reasonable question, not just for formative evaluations, but for any study. How many subjects do you need? I just read a dissertation in Norway where it was what they called a beta test. It was a human factor study. And she was claiming that she only needed 10 students, 10 people to do this study. And that seemed too small to me. But if it's the first of a series of evaluation studies, then you can start with a smaller group first time around, and then increase the group the second time around. You need enough people so that you're going to have different experiences with the interface or with the materials or with the assessments or whatever, so that you do get feedback. So a smaller group is okay the first time around. If you're close to field testing, which would be a later stage informative evaluation, then you need more numbers. You probably need more than 20 or so the second time around. So I think it depends on if you're only going to do one study, then more is better than fewer. If you're going to do a series, you can have maybe 10 the first time, 20 the second time. If you do studies with comparison groups, the general rule of thumb, it depends again on the particular experimental design, but you need at least 20 for each group that gets a different intervention. But, there are variations depending on the specific experimental design. Yeah. How long did they get to use it? That depends on the product. If it's a system dynamics simulation, we did one of these with a chemical engineering distillery plant. They need several hours, and they had repeated experiences with the simulation environment, and each time it was a couple hours each time. In my assessment studies, and that was just for the assessment, using that methodology I showed you, I allowed 3 hours for each of those problems. It typically didn't take 3 hours. Experts took less than an hour, and the novices took maybe 2 hours, but that's just for the assessment. Yeah. So a fair amount of time. If it's any sophisticated thing at all, several hours, and maybe several times, several hours each. Any other questions?
You have a category of titles, some subject in educational research?
A category of which?
Of subjects. For example, e-learning, is it a subject?
Oh, yeah.
This kind of
I don't have one, but you know where there was the best source for this? I don't know if any of you were familiar with Educational Resource Information Clearinghouses, ERIC, E-R-I-C. There used to be 16 clearinghouses sponsored by the U.S. government. I'm going to make a politically incorrect statement here briefly. And thanks to our wonderful leader, they shut down all 16 of these clearinghouses. But those clearinghouses, and one of the areas was information technology with its impact on education. Those clearinghouses had very well-defined areas of research, questions, keywords, and so forth. There is still a central ERIC clearinghouse, but they've taken all of those keywords and put them into one common area for areas of investigation. So it's not as meaningful as it used to be. So one place to go would be the ERIC clearinghouse that still exists, a consolidated ERIC clearinghouse. Another place to go would be professional AERA, American Education and Research Association. There's a European similar group called EARLI, the European Association for Research on Learning and Instruction. I don't know if I had Learning and Instruction as one of the journals, but that's a good European journal to publish in. They all have a list of, when you join as a member, they ask you what your specialty is. And that list of specialization is a good place to go for topic areas. And AECT has the same thing. AERA has a very comprehensive set of categories. And that would be a way to organize topics for research, if that's what you're asking. Yeah. So there, maybe somebody else has other places to go to think about that. But ERIC was a great place to get good stuff. Too bad they shut down the clearinghouses. I told you government funding can go up and down, and that was a case where it went down in the United States, and one of our best educational resources got smashed as a result. Any other questions?
What is your suggestion if we doing research to adopting the new technology into the instruction and learning, and what kind of result you think is valid for EDI?
Oh, there's, yeah, any number of these. From what I've heard about what you're doing, studies just on access in areas that didn't have access before would be one. new ways of presenting material. So I know there was the concept mapping methodology that we talked about before, where you have a new way of doing declarative knowledge. And so how are we going to represent declarative knowledge? So involving users and annotating a concept map is a new way of approaching that. So it's constructed in that sense. So the learner has to add something to the concept map, and then the system or the instructor can give feedback on what the learner added. That's a new approach. So comparing outcomes of that approach with a standard approach, that's a real core kind of ETR&D paper.
Anyone else can ask questions?
The significance of research, the consideration of accepting. Do you consider the significance of research when you review a paper?
You mean whether there's no significant difference, or the effect size, or on the research? If you do any kind of quantitative study on either side of the journal, we want you to report the effect size. If there's no significant difference, if that's what you're asking, it doesn't rule you out.
No, slightly different. For example, maybe people think that my research is conducted on a small group in a small country, and then maybe the reviewer may think that this regard is not significant, or the international reader won't be interested in this kind of research. That's kind of concern.
Yeah, two things come to mind. One is, if it turns out that there's something about it that might be regionally specific because of the cultural group involved, ETR&D has an international review section where papers can be put there. So there is a third section for the papers. And it's not because they're less rigorous, but it's specifically because they might, maybe it's about Muslim education in Indonesia. So that's very specific to a region and a culture. So that doesn't mean it's ruled out of ETR&D, it's just put into the international review section. The study is rigorous, it's a good study, but it pertains to a particular area, and nobody in Taiwan would do that probably, or the United States. So that's a case where it still can go in. Second comment is, when I became editor of ETR&D, I said one of the things I want to do is make this an international journal and not an American journal. So I mentioned there are 6 members of the editorial board. Right now, only 2 of those people are Americans. The other 4 are non-Americans. So the core editorial board is actually quite international and has a broad outlook. And if you look at the last 5 years in ETR&D, we've published lots of papers that are in studies in other countries. So don't think that it's not relevant just because it's a small group. Taiwan's not such a small country. I don't know if that answers it.
What is the hottest topic research area in the United States or in the world?
Hottest?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, e-learning is a hot topic. Gaming is a hot topic. You know, how does gaming contribute to learning? Those are hot topics for funding. Funding anyway. Not so much solicitation. Medical research is funded a lot. We're getting old. These Americans are getting old, so we want people to help us.
Do you know Confucius?
Who? Confucius?
The Chinese great teacher.
Yes, I've heard.
2,000 years ago.
Yes.
I mean, it is possible to use Confucius' teaching skill in the modern learning system.
Yeah, this idea of telling, showing, and doing comes from, it's usually attributed to Confucius as a model. If you think, there's a paper by Merrill, published in ETR&D in 2002, called First Principles of Instruction. And he has 5 principles. The first is, and he argues that instruction will be more or less effective in correlation with how well these 5 principles are integrated in the instruction. Instruction should be problem-centered is number 1, built around meaningful problems. Number 2, the instruction should activate relevant prior knowledge of learners. So there's some telling going on. This is one of Confucius's things. The second one is there should be a demonstration of new knowledge and skills to learners. There's a showing going on, tell and show. Number 3 is that learners should apply new knowledge to solve meaningful problems. So that's an application. That's the doing stuff that you get from Confucius. And the last one in Merrill, the 5th principle, is learners should integrate new knowledge and skills into their everyday life. That's the transfer issue. So I think Merrill's principles, that's what I said before. We haven't changed in 2000 or however many years it's been. I mean, it's the same stuff that you can find in Confucius. And I read a paper, I'm editing the Handbook of Research on Educational Communications and Technologies. One of the authors of one of the chapters quotes Confucius. So if that answers your question, I hope it does. Yes?
Technology information, technology in education is, well known, is a very interdisciplinary research. And of course, we have some educational background researchers, we have some computer science background researchers, and not even the brain researchers. And we have some research about dream-based learning, dream-based research. This means that those kind of research will apply in maybe 10 years later. And we have some adopt-based research, means that we really use that information technology in the school, in the current learning environment. My question is, I'm wondering that what kind of papers if you prefer? I mean, you prefer the theory-oriented research or system-oriented research or evaluation-oriented research?
I don't think there's a preference, and I give it to the reviewers when I get these papers. I don't have a preference for those. And those are all acceptable. They'd be different kinds of papers, and I probably would pick different reviewers for those papers.
Professor, I have a question. We know the distance learning, M-learning and the e-learning. I mean, how do you define the U-learning, ubiquitous learning?
Which learning?
Yes. Ubiquitous.
Ubiquitous learning?
Yes.
Yeah, so that would actually encompass all of those. So it would be mobile learning, e-learning, so anywhere where you can be connected with any kind of connection. There's a lot of talk about ubiquitous learning. That's another one of your hot topics, and it was one of the trends I think identified in one of the slides. So it would involve any of those technologies. It could be PDAs that are networked in a classroom. It could be the kind of PDA I have that delivers over a cell phone line, things from the internet, or it could be an internet connection by wire, which we didn't connect, or wireless. So all of those would be part of ubiquitous learning. It would encompass all of those. But, Pierre Dillenbourg's view is the more these technologies become part of everyday life, the less we're going to talk about e-learning or m-learning or u-learning. It'll just be learning. Because just like, well, you don't have a blackboard in here or even a whiteboard. But it'll be as commonplace as the blackboard. We don't talk about a blackboard in a classroom, the chalkboard. I mean, because we got used to that. We're going to be used to all of these technologies in the not very distant future. And then the good news is we can think about learning again, and not the E or the M or the U.
Hi, Professor. We have noticed that you have spent several years in Norway. Right? So, did you notice any different research orientation between the Norwegian students and the American students?
Yeah, Norwegian students, there's a strong, in the computer science tradition in Scandinavia, there's a strong movement for participatory design. So this came out of Scandinavia. So they like design-oriented research, and they like to extend this to educational research. So they like qualitative studies where the learners become part of the design team, and it's very constructivist and design-oriented. So more qualitative studies, not so many quantitative traditional studies, and not very strong notion of what the outcome on learning was, but a good sense about how people interacted in the design or development process. That helps out.
Okay, I think all of us learned a lot from that perspective, and hope we have more chance to discuss. And we thank Dr. Spector